Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world. I do hope that you're doing remarkably well. And we've got a lovely story tonight. I don't know if you remember when we had a dying woman's confession story, and that was phenomenal. Little did I realise that I would actually get a man who was dying with an amazing story to tell, and that's tonight's story that's just going to knock your socks off. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Jamie and I grew up in Denver, Colorado, known as the Mile High City, which has earned an amazing reputation over the years for the 70 breweries that produce the very best craft beers that you've ever tasted in your entire life, without sounding remotely biased, of course. My boyfriend Niall strongly recommends the Imperial Stout Dark Beer from the Hog's Head. So if you're ever in Denver and you enjoy dark beer, this is invariably the choice for you. We are known for our meticulously clean city, low unemployment levels, and let's not forget really amazing food. And for pizza lovers out there, you should try Denver's deep dish, because their pizzas are absolutely brilliant. One word of warning though, if you're watching your weight, grab those loose-fitting clothes, because you'll never be able to resist the sumptuous food on offer in our part of the world. As you can imagine, I grew up surrounded by the most exquisite, ravishing mountainous views, crisp fresh air, and totally breathtaking scenery. If you look to the west, you can see the exquisite statuesque mountains of Mount Evans and Grace Peak. And if you glance towards the east, you'll observe Kansas and Nebraska. We are lucky to live in this part of the world, because although it gets hot, it is a dry heat which is so much more bearable, with low humidity. So yes, Denver is a very great place to live, and if you like outdoor adventures and pursuits, it'll tick all the boxes for you. I grew up in a very charming residential neighbourhood of West Highlands, where I was raised in a beautiful, elegant, quintessential Victorian home, with my father and mother and my two brothers Eugene and Peter, and as the children of parents working in the medical field, invariably the subjects discussed over the dinner table were always associated with the medical profession. My dad worked as a local doctor and my mother worked as a mortician's assistant, dealing with post-mortems after death, and some of the stories she would invariably tell us, especially about mysterious cases and unusual deaths, would leave me completely spellbound. It was hardly surprising as children that we all naturally gravitated toward the medical profession as our careers after we left school. And even as a little girl growing up, I would dress up in a nurse's outfit and play nursey with a plastic kid's stethoscope and thermometer, and I would go around the house telling everybody that I had made them so very much better, and they had been at death's door, of course. I suppose it was inevitable that I would end up in the medical profession myself, and I chose to become a private nurse, dealing with the death and dying and terminally ill patients, and not for a moment have I ever regretted that decision, as you might expect. So many people ask me here in Denver, why in the world would you become a nurse for the terminally ill? Surely you must get very depressed dealing with the dying, but the reverse is most certainly true. I find dealing with people facing the winter of their lives to be a very great privilege and a huge honour to be bestowed upon me, because dying is indeed a very intimate, personal journey for the patient. In truth, the dying have taught me how to appreciate life and to grab it with both hands, and they've also shown me the value of human relationships and the priceless gift of love. In my job, I work with patients in their home environment, administering drugs like morphine to help with pain management, and some of them even smoke cannabis, as it's legal here in Colorado, to help with pain issues. I also attend to their daily needs, as well as reading and talking to them so that they are never truly alone on their journey. Another aspect of my job involves reassuring family members and helping them emotionally deal with this tumultuous time that they are invariably going through, when heightened emotions are exceedingly raw and moods are turbulent. My story begins when I decided to take on a full-time job with a man living in a cabin in the woods in Aspen in Colorado, which is a gloriously beautiful place to live. It is situated in a remote portion of the Rocky Mountains and is known for its gloriously powdery slopes, quaking aspen trees, and thriving ski resorts, not to mention the all-year-round recreational activities. The summers here are warm and the winters freezing with tons of snow. And when this area is carpeted with snow, it looks like a dreamy winter wonderland. It is so magnificent, and I just love it when the bristlecone pine trees are literally caked in fresh snow. Without question, this part of the world is ravishingly beautiful, with a population of elk, mule deer and bighorn sheep, and occasionally, soaring above us in the skies, in regal splendour, is the majestic golden eagle, which is, in my opinion, the most majestic bird ever to grace our azure blue Colorado skies. I remember the day that I arrived at Hugo's exquisitely beautiful large cabin, nestled in the heart of the woods, which to me was much more like a palatial timber mansion. It was made from yellow cedar and was outrageously extravagant and opulent, like something you would expect a movie star to own. It was spread out on 2 stories, with numerous balconies, patios and walls of glass, and the inside of the cabin was equally as breathtaking and sumptuously cosy, adorned with exquisite oakwood furnishings, large stone fireplaces, and deep red Persian carpets. When I met the remarkable Hugo, he was an extraordinary man, and it was such a privilege to get to know him. But boy, was he emaciated and thin, and his skin had taken on a very deep yellow hue, which is so typically seen in advanced stage liver disease. It was hard to conceive that the jubilant figure of a well-nourished, happy man in the photograph that I was looking at, showing off a massive fish that he had caught, was indeed the same wasted, scrawly man lying before me in the bed, now merely a fraction of his former self. I could tell by his deteriorating physical condition and extreme muscle wastage that he didn't have much time left, but even though there were times he became disorientated, muddled and confused due to the toxic overload of the liver, which ultimately affects the cognitive brain function, however, there were times he was very compos mentis, and in those moments we would talk about anything and everything together, and these were wonderful moments that I shall never ever forget. As I've worked with the terminally ill for so long, I never pussyfoot around about the subject of death, because I find my patients want to talk about the subject, but are often afraid to talk about it with their family and friends, so they always delight in the fact that I talk about death as easily as I talk about the weather outside, and that invariably is a massive relief to them. In my experience, many families don't want to talk about death and dying to their loved ones, which becomes like the proverbial boomerang in the room that everyone chooses to ignore. But in my experience, the dying person usually knows that their bodies is shutting down, and they do tend to go through that whole dying process shenanigans, from denial to anger to pleading with God, and then finally to acceptance. "Are you afraid to die?" I asked Hugo once. "Oh, heavens no," said Hugo. "As long as I'm not in pain, I'm fine about the dying process. I've had a good long life, and I'm ready for the next stage of my journey." "Does that mean that you believe in a hereafter?" I said. "Oh, most certainly I believe in God and in Jesus, and recently I've been experiencing some very vivid dreams." "That's very common too, well, among dying patients, of course, along with visitations from deceased relatives," I said. "I get that too a lot." "Oh, well, I've had that too," said Hugo. "I've been afraid to tell anyone because I thought they'd think it a side effect of my disease, because you can imagine, when you get liver disease, you do tend to get confused, and people think you're just muddled when you suggest you're seeing people." "Well, tell me about your dreams and visitations," I said. "I'm intrigued and, of course, fascinated." "Well, I've been dreaming of flying and soaring above the cities and clouds through space and beyond time, and then I do find myself floating to a very beautiful city where the roads are literally paved in gold. When I try to enter the city, this very gargantuan, giant-sized man, dressed in white, wearing sandals, keeps telling me it's not my time and I've got to go back. I keep protesting and begging to be let into this beautiful city, but he keeps telling me, "Not yet." "It sounds very beautiful," I said. "Much more magnificent than anything on the earth plane," he sighed longingly. "And if that's heaven, I'd leave this place in a heartbeat. It was that beautiful, and the colours were so bright and luminescent." "What about the visitations?" I asked. "Tell me about them." "Oh, I've been seeing my best friend Ernest. He was an awesome scriptwriter with me in the 80s and was killed tragically in a motorbike accident when he was flung violently into a tree and killed instantly. I never ever got over his ghastly death, and that's why I drowned my pitiful sorrows in drink, which is why I got myself into this precarious predicament in the first place, with my damaged liver, of course. I drank the wretched, unrelentless pain away, which was not the wisest thing I've ever done. Still, I can't complain, because I've had a very good life. So what does Ernest do when he visits you? I asked. He sits on that chair over there and smiles, and he looks at me and taps his watch and says, "Not long now." He's wearing his Harley-Davidson leather jacket, which is really rather funny because he lived in that thing when he was alive and clearly hasn't taken it off in the afterlife. I sincerely hope they have washing machines up there, or else my friend Ernest is going to pong to high heaven when I see him again. Wow, I said, wow, that is an amazing story. In the weeks that followed, I became incredibly close to Hugo, who has the warmest heart and the most delightful sense of humour. Well, he had it, of course. And as is always the case with dying patients, you become incredibly caught up with the family and their emotional struggles and upheavals during this turbulent, challenging and tumultuous time. And he had a very wonderful, charming family that was so engaged with Hugo and wanted to be very involved in the dying process with him and to say their final goodbyes when the time invariably came. Luckily, the process of dying, with its so many stages, can invariably prepare the family for the road ahead, which is why so often the sudden unexpected deaths are the worst of all to deal with for loved ones who are left behind. So sometimes a slower death like Hugo's can in fact be a very huge gift. One day when I was accessing YouTube on my Samsung tablet while Hugo was sleeping and I was listening to a series on Bigfoot encounters, because I've always been a huge Bigfoot fan and have been mercilessly teased as a result by my entire family, who seem to believe that my fascination with the hairy critter borders on the insane. I thought I would play it for Hugo to listen to as a change from my usual routine of playing background music for him to listen to. Suddenly Hugo opened his eyes very wide, and as he listened to the encounter, he sat up and smiled, and his eyes grew very wide. "That's not an encounter," he said, remarking about the video that I was actually listening to. "That's just hearsay. Did he see it, or didn't he? Was it a black bear, or was it just a shadow? What was it that crossed his path?" I remember my heart just sank when Hugo was speaking like this. Was he going to ridicule me, like the rest of my entire family, by insisting that Bigfoot was a fictitious creature and that I was completely bonkers for actually believing in him? "Now that's not an encounter," continued Hugo. "Not like the Bigfoot encounter I had as a boy. Now that's an encounter." "You saw Bigfoot," I gasped. "You saw Bigfoot?" "I most certainly did," said Hugo. "Would you like me to tell you about it?" My eyes sparkled with exuberant enthusiasm. "Like I said? Are you kidding? I'd love it." So this was Hugo's story, which I'm about to share with you now. One day when I was about 12 years old, I was playing in the woods with my brother Donovan near our home, which is something I did every single day after school. We adored the woods because it was alive with most gorgeous birdsong, all kinds of deer, and indigenous wildlife as well. My brother and I befriended a squirrel there, whom had become so tame he would literally run up and down our shoulders and eat out of our hands. We called him Chips, and every time we went into the woods, we would feed him peanuts. We were amazed by how tame Chips was, because all the other squirrels kept a safe distance. But one squirrel, watching our encounter with Chips, suddenly became intrigued, and seeing that Chips could attain immense amounts of peanuts from us, realised that he was missing out enormously. So he overcame his shyness, and soon we had 2 squirrels eating out of our hands. We called the other squirrel Pip. One day as we were feeding the squirrels, we heard this thunderous noise, an amazing commotion, and it really seemed like something very big, like an army tank, was speeding through the woods, at one heck of a speed. Now, squirrels are very timid, reticent creatures at the very best of times, and yet both Chip and Pip were not at all frightened off by the noise, although the other squirrels invariably were, which seems strangely familiar to them. Donovan and I were petrified by this noise because we hadn't heard anything like it before, but things were about to get a whole lot more frightening for us because bolting through the woods and standing only yards away from us was the biggest creature that the two of us had ever seen. What did he look like? I asked, growing very excited. Well, he was awesome, said Hugo. Words cannot describe the powerful presence that this creature exuded. The energy of this creature was unlike anything I've ever encountered before. He was very big, but his presence was even bigger. He was so masterful and impressive, and very definitely an apex predator. I was in awe and in terror at the very same time. You see, this critter was not something that I knew even existed in America at the time, and the size of this thing boggles the mind. I mean, it was enormous, and for a 12-year-old boy, I was already quite tall, nearing 6 foot, but this thing made me feel pathetically tiny and inconspicuous. He was gargantuan. How big do you think it actually was? I asked. Well, I'd say he was over 10 foot tall. He was about 1,000 pounds, maybe more, maybe less, 5 feet wide, built like an army tank, and very, very stocky and muscular. He was covered with long dark hair that had a very lovely shine and an auburn tint to it. I'd say he had the typical Bigfoot characteristics that are described today, like the typical cone-shaped head, the massive shoulders, huge feet and hands, and overlong arms. Did you think he looked more human-like or ape-like? That's a very good question. I'm not altogether sure, because he definitely had human-like characteristics, but he also had ape-like characteristics, and I can't really discern which was which, but he had an amalgamation of both, if you get my drift. What happened next? I asked. The critter looked very shocked to see us, and when I say shocked, I mean it looked very shocked, as if his cover had finally been blown. He wasn't happy to be spotted by us at all. I sensed that at once. He stood there just goggling at us in a stupefied silence, and for a moment between all of us there was just this long silence. And then a very peculiar thing happened that broke the silence. Chip literally went racing over from us to the big critter and dashed up his body like a great big tree trunk and started nibbling at the Bigfoot's mouth. The Bigfoot immediately popped an acorn in its mouth, sticking it out like a large tongue so that Chip could nibble away at it, and that is exactly what it did. And I realised in horror that the critter was the very reason that Chip was so tame, and it had the magic touch, had absolutely nothing to do with us, as I had vainly so falsely believed. You see, Chip and this critter were really bonded, much more so than with us. I could see that all too clearly now. It was incredible. But aren't Bigfoots supposed to eat squirrels? I said. Well, I'm sure they do, but it would seem that Chip had an extraordinary relationship with the critter, which I guess would make him the exception to the rule, unless, of course, the Bigfoot chose not to eat squirrels altogether. Did the Bigfoot not mind that you were actually watching him feed Chip? No, funny enough, I don't think he minded at all. After a while, he began to relax, because you see, he saw that Chip had befriended us as well, and was darting from us to the Bigfoot, from us back to the Bigfoot again. So, you know, like squirrels go from one tree to the next, rather like that. It suddenly made us seem much more amenable to him. I got the impression that he hadn't particularly warmed to humans in the past before. Well, maybe one of his family members had had a bad experience with a hunter, I suggested. Good thought, said Hugo. I hadn't thought of that. Anyway, my brother Jonathan stepped forward to hand the Bigfoot some peanuts to feed Chip. But the Bigfoot snatched the peanuts and poured them down his throat and ate the whole lot. Now, that was not a small amount of peanuts that he guzzled in 1 second, let me tell you. You mean he just poured them all down his throat in one serving? Oh, yes, chuckled Hugo. It was quite a sight, let me tell you. The Bigfoot then pointed to the packet and then put on a very sad expression on his face, and we all cracked up laughing because he was incredibly comical, and we could tell he was enjoying our laughter. He knew we were laughing at him. After that, he would pull all kinds of contorted expressions for us that were so hysterical that my brother and I were always wetting ourselves. My mother was thinking that we had a serious problem with bladder control, because invariably we would return home with saturated pants, laughing ourselves senseless because that critter was hilariously funny. And when my mother would ask us what was wrong with us, we would be reminded of the critter's hilarious expressions, and we would laugh all the more, and we just couldn't stop. I remember hearing my mother tell my dad that she was extremely worried about our pant-wetting problem that was happening on a daily basis, and she thought we had a serious physical problem with our bladder. My father told her that there were bigger things to worry about than the state of our bladders. For a long time we'd meet up with the squirrel and the Bigfoot, because now the Bigfoot knew we were bringing him peanuts. He was always around, and also he enjoyed the audience that we gave him when we laughed at him so much. He was so comical and so funny, and I just think the relationship with all of us just grew. We all became very fond of each other. We gave him chips and bags of grapes and, peanuts all the time, and it was fantastic. I remember my mother complaining bitterly about the peanuts we were buying and telling us that we might be feeding the entire squirrel population at this rate. She did tend to be a little bit on the tight side in those days. Did you tell your mother about the Bigfoot? Oh, not on your Nelly, are you kidding? My mother was a no-nonsense math teacher. She'd never have believed us in the first place. It took her months to believe us that we were actually hand-feeding squirrels in the woods. She said it was impossible to tame them. Did you tell anybody else about the Bigfoot? No, I know it's strange, but when you meet a critter like that, you really don't want to tell anybody about it. Not only because you might be ridiculed, but because the experience was really rather magical and very special and deeply intimate and personal. I suppose in truth it was something I just didn't want to share with anyone. But you're sharing it with me now. Well, it seems a dreadful waste to die without leaving behind my story for somebody else to enjoy. What happened next? I asked. Unfortunately, when I was 15, I was sent to boarding school. Our parents moved closer to the school so we could come home for the odd weekend. So we never saw Chip, Pip or the Bigfoot we chose to call Bobbin ever again. And believe it or not, he grew to know his name. Now that's an encounter, my dear. Not all this nonsense about black shadows crossing your path. That's hardly an encounter. Wow, it most certainly is an encounter. Thank you so much, Hugo, for sharing it with me. Within a week of hearing about Hugo's extraordinary Bigfoot encounter, he died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his family and friends, on the 15th of July 2002 at about 4:30 p.m. The day before he died, he did actually tell me that his best friend Ernest had appeared to him and was tapping his watch extra quickly. He told me that he got the very strong impression that he meant that he would be going very, very soon. All these years later, I think of Hugo with so much love, and his Bigfoot encounter quite literally knocked my socks off, and I hope it will do the same for your listeners. Well, I just want to say that certainly knocked my socks off, and I know it will have knocked the socks off of all my listeners listening, and we feel very privileged that Hugo was willing to share that story with you and pass it on to us, because no doubt anybody who's going to listen is really going to appreciate this story. What an incredible encounter. Thank you so very much. Until next time, goodbye and good night.